Just before we start, don't forget, John and I are live on stage. The red velvet seats, I can see them now, John, of the Olympia, the 5th of March. Dave McWilliams podcast live. Get your tickets at ticketmaster.ie.
See you there.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It's podcast time. You know that drill. John looks quizzically at me. I look quizzically back at John. We try to answer some questions about the world. We're going to talk about the chances of a global recession.
Cheery stuff, yeah?
Cheery stuff. That'll put the skids on you. How are you, Ed?
I'm very good. Yeah. I'm a bit sore all over from hitting...
You're hitting the gym.
Oh, hitting the gym.
You should see him ripped. Ripped. He is a specimen.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of subtlety and subtlety of movements and muscular movements,
Yes.
I want to talk about arthritic injections for old dogs.
Oh, poor Sasha.
Now, you and I are very close to taking the same drugs.
Yes.
Right?
You may have slipped a couple.
Exactly. Bought them
Yeah.
on that funny...
Can't see what kind of buzz you're going to get, you know?
I know, and the buzz, I was in the vet yesterday, right? So Sasha is now 14, which is 98 in a dog's year, right? And because she's a Labrador, she gets arthritis and rheumatism. That's what happens to the labs. And their joints all seize up. Not the joints you're thinking about, their actual knee joints and whatever, right? And there's a wonder drug, an amazing drug called Librela.
Right.
And it's an arthritic drug that was given to humans. And then somebody said, well, why don't we give it to dogs? Right? Because they say, so it's a tiny dose of what the humans get.
Yeah.
And Sasha's been having it for the last about year, and it's made a massive difference to her life. Like, she's running around, maybe not like a puppy, but she's up and about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I was up in the vet yesterday, and of course they've run out of it. This is the supply chain. This is where I come back to inflation.
Oh, right.
So all over Ireland, vets are trying to get this Librela drug, and they can't get their hands on it because it's imported, right? And what is happening is the global supply chain. So you imagine how complex it is to make just one drug. You know, you're getting all sorts of things from everywhere. Bits are being made all around the world. And because supply chains are tightening up, and because there's this idea that the demand for this was subdued, and now it's gone through the roof. And of course, supply chains can't react very quickly, so the price is going up. And I was thinking to myself, you know, as I was talking to the vet, he was probably looking at me as I was glazing over, thinking, is this a supply chain issue? Is this an inflation issue? But this is how economics impacts on your life.
Yeah.
You know, that the
And
actual...
Sasha's life.
Yeah. And so it's an alleviate arthritic pain for a full month. It's an amazing drug. I have even the leaflet here. How does it work? It's an innovative new therapy called monoclonal antibodies. It is a biological therapy that works like your dog's own immune system. It targets and neutralizes a protein that stimulates pain in patients with arthritis.
This is a sponsorship read, right?
No, this is not a sponsor. I'd love if we got sponsored by a dog rheumatic pharmaceutical product.
Except they won't be able to supply the gear.
Well, could you imagine actually if this podcast ended up with a lead sponsor that was rheumatism for old dogs? That would be kind of perfect for us.
Go on, what's your
John,
amazing segue?
My amazing segue is the link between rheumatism in dogs, the rate of inflation, the supply chain, whether or not inflation is transitory or not, and the threat of a global recession. So when you're sitting in the vet discussing whether the back leg of the old Labrador works, very few people's mind would jump to global recessions, but that is what we do here. And let's go and talk to Dario Perkins, a fantastic economist over in the UK, got his finger on the pulse of inflation, monetary policy, central banks, to see what the hell is going on, particularly with central banks. It's always very worrying in economics when central bankers become the story, and what they do in the vaults of central banks becomes the issue. When, of course, the issue is inflation, lowflation. What are central bankers going to do? Are they really as important as they think they are? You know, they go to a thing called Jackson's Hole every year, which is in Wyoming, and they have this shindig. I think it's in the middle of summer. I think it's in August, right? And they have these Delphic quotes about their perception of the world and etc. Now, I speak as a former central banker, so I'm kind of speaking about my own tribe in one way. But ultimately, the question is, do they have as much power, or are they beholden to the markets more than the society? Or what are the central tenets of central banking, and why are they important now? And luckily, I have a man on the line who knows all this stuff. Dario Perkins is over in outside London. Whereabouts are you, Dario?
I live in Tunbridge Wells.
Tunbridge Wells, a place which the commuter loves. His agitated Tunbridge Wells. What was the letter into the Times, wasn't it? Yours annoyed, Tunbridge Wells.
Disgusted.
Yours disgusted. What's your perception now about what's going on with central banking?
Well, I'm totally disgusted about No, I think that, well, there's no doubt they believe their own hype. They take a lot of credit amongst themselves for the fact that inflation has been low for the last 40 years. And they look back on the 1970s, when we had those big wage price spirals and 15 years of very high inflation. And they think that was a big monetary policy error. And they think that it was Volcker, Paul Volcker in the US, who squashed inflation. And then ever since then, they've delivered what they call this nominal anchor, which is kind of anchored inflation down at low levels and kept it there because they're so powerful and so credible. And they believe that, these tiny manipulations of interest rates can drive and fine tune this economy. And of course, it's all kind of bizarre. There's big structural forces that have kept inflation down over the last 30, 40 years, globalization, technology, demographics. And I think, the central bank role has been relatively minor. I mean, it has been there, but it's been relatively minor.
Can I stop you and come back to it? So tell me, how does globalization bear down on inflation? How does demographics and how does technology? Explain those three big sort of what economists called deflationary impulses. Explain them to me.
Well, if you think about the 1970s, we had closed economies, so there was not much competition across countries. We had powerful trade unions. We had a young militant workforce. And we basically had a decade of conflict. We've talked about this before. Inflation comes from power. And we had this power struggle between capital and labor. And that, lasted the best part of 15 years. And that gave us those very powerful wage price spirals. And then, we effectively squashed that. We globalized our economies. We destroyed trade unions. We destroyed worker power. We opened up the world to these, workers from overseas in terms of immigration and, global markets. And it totally changed those power dynamics in the economy. So we've had this period now where inflation has been very, very low. And the wage share of the economy has been going down and down and down. So corporate power has kind of been dominant during that period. And I think, central banks have played a role in suppressing inflation, but I think that they wildly overstate the role that they've played. And I think, they kind of have to because, they're
because that's their gig.
That's their gig. If your one job is to control inflation, then you have to believe that you're able to control inflation. But now we're in this really perverse situation because, the inflation that we have now has got nothing to do with monetary policy. We've had these massive distortions in our economy over the past 2 years. Governments were very good at preventing a depression from, preventing a serious recession. They basically topped up everybody's income, but we could only spend that income in a very small part of the economy. So we all sat at home buying things off the internet, and of course, that created massive goods inflation. Now, we're in this situation where inflation everywhere is really high because of these distortions have continued. And we've got central banks looking at this and thinking, oh my God, inflation is at 7% in the US or 5% in Europe. What are we going to do? We're going to have to prove that we're credible. And so now, they're coming out very, very hawkish. We've had this massive hawkish pivot over the last few months. As they've, tried to convince people that they're serious. And so, this is taken to a bizarre when you've got, Andrew Bailey, chief economist of the Bank of England, basically telling people amidst this massive squeeze in incomes, everyone's being squeezed by this. Every day, the news is about, the cost of living crisis and, wages not rising and us getting squeezed by this. And he's out there saying, well, you're just going to have to accept this because if you don't, we're going to raise interest rates and some of you are going to be unemployed. I mean, it's bizarre. But when you take that kind of mainstream economics idea and you turn it into simple English, you can come across quite badly. And that's the problem these central bankers have.
Well, let's focus on that because you said about a couple of minutes ago the share between labor and capital in the economy. And this idea that always and ever the worker should pay as opposed to the owner of capital should pay. Let's get all Marxist before we go on, right? So there's an inherent bias in what the chief economist of the Bank of England is saying, chief economists of most central banks are saying, which is basically that if we have a problem, the adjustment comes on the wage of the average person, as opposed to the profit margins of the average corporation. Because if we look at it, what we could do is we could reduce profits, keep wages the same, and bear down on inflation. Where do you think the bias comes from?
I think the bias comes from this belief that unemployment is ultimately your tool for controlling inflation. So if you have an inflation problem, this is the Phillips curve that central bankers are obsessed with. This idea that if you have an inflation problem, the best way to get inflation down is to create a bit more unemployment because you suppress people's wage demands. If you make them fearful of losing their jobs, they're not going to demand big wages. So it's kind of inbuilt in the way mainstream economics thinks. It's this basic relationship between unemployment and inflation which guides everything, and it is a kind of intellectual bias. It's a kind of
it's a very serious bias because what it's basically saying is that.
Well, this has been the argument, hasn't it? The argument is that for over 30 years, we've tolerated more unemployment than we needed to because of this belief that central bankers have had about how the economy works. And actually, if they'd allow the economy to run a bit hotter, we could have got unemployment to lower levels. And that might not have created these kind of wage price spirals that we had in the 70s. This obsession with the 1970s is really bizarre when you think that we've had nothing like the 1970s since then. And even if you look all across the kind of economic history, that period of the 1970s is really odd. There's no other period where you have those kinds of dynamics.
Absolutely. But it's a collective memory. It's also an age thing that the people who are largely in power, the very upper echelons of the finance game and the advisor game are probably in their 60s and 70s now, probably at the sort of the very end of their career. And they have a collective neurosis about the 1970s because they remember it. And they were also, if they don't remember it, they were educated by people who remember it. And so consequently, they come with a toolbox, which is entirely jaundiced for fixing a problem that may have been peculiar to a certain decade and is now no longer relevant.
That's why we have them. That's why we have independent central banks, because of the 1970s. This was the lesson that economics took, that if we didn't have an independent central bank that was determined to create a bit of unemployment to make sure inflation stayed low, then we would just keep repeating those mistakes over and over again. And so, the one central bank, the Bundesbank, which came out of the 1970s with its credibility intact, has repeatedly made that mistake. Every time there's an oil price shock, they've been going, oh my God, it's 1970s again. Oh my God, it's 1970s again. We need to tighten policy. And of course, those oil price shocks that we've had, and there's been lots of them over the last, 20 years, they've never generated those kinds of dynamics again. So that basic view has just been consistently wrong.
So let's look at right now. Okay, so if you're listening to the show and you're thinking, okay, maybe you're over in the UK, you're listening to the Bank of England raising rates, you're listening to the Fed raising rates, ECB are probably going to join that chorus quite soon, maybe in a slightly less effusive, less operatic way, but they will join it, right? And you're thinking, okay, so I've just been told my energy bills are going up. I've just been told my wages have to go down. And I've just been told for good measure, my mortgage rate's going to go up. How does the average person make sense of this?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's bizarre. And I think that message, that the Bank of England in particular has been giving over the last few weeks, basically threatening people not to try to get wage increases to offset the fact that they're being squeezed, has been, completely tone deaf. And I think it's looked really bad for them. I think this has been a real problem. It's very hard. But I think, basically, I mean, if you wanted to be kind to the Bank of England, you would say that, the UK in particular has suffered this shock from Brexit, because immigration is...
No. You've suffered a shock from the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news and Newsnight, looking at the bonkers creatures inside your parliament houses. That's the shock you've suffered. I want to talk to you about that in a second, because that's bad stuff.
That's totally right. But I think that that you could say that because of Brexit, there is going to be this squeeze on the economy. We're going to get more inflation than we have before because we've got less immigration, because we've cut off some of our trading partners. And so there has to be, this is the way the central banks think, there has to be a squeeze on the real economy. And so that squeeze either has to happen by itself, because wages don't keep up with prices, which is what's happening right now. If workers can resist that and you get these kind of wage price spirals, then the central bank has to come in and cause the squeeze itself. So there's a lot of pessimism, I think, about what the supply side of the economy can achieve that is kind of embedded in this. And maybe the UK is a special case, but I think you're getting examples of this in the US as well. I mean, the Fed has given up on labour force participation coming back. So all these workers that dropped out of the labour force during the pandemic, it's now decided that those workers aren't coming back. And that's also making them more hawkish.
Okay, now let's look, because I've always thought the UK is a special case because it has been a more inflationary economy than almost any other developed economy in the last 30 years. It's got this fear of it. There's also a sort of a constant hoping that sterling will devalue in order to accommodate all that sort of stuff. I think the UK is slightly more inflationary, more prone to inflation than other economies. But let's come to the idea of financial markets. So if the central bankers, as we just said, are not talking to the average dude on the street, okay, and explaining to them the inexplicable, is their primary audience just financial markets and the fear that what they will do is they will frighten the horses, as they used to say to me in the Irish Central Bank years ago?
I think there's definitely an element of that. I mean, clearly, people in financial markets look much more closely at what these central bankers are saying, and it is their natural audience. So I think that's part of it. I think that part of the mechanism through which this is supposed to work, this tightening, is it's supposed to tighten financial conditions. And so the squeeze is supposed to start in financial markets. And I think you've seen that over the past few months. There's been a lot more volatility in markets. Investors are much more concerned about what's happening. And in part, it's the nature of this kind of weird cycle that we're in, because, this hasn't been a normal business cycle. We basically shut down our economy and we reopened it again. And quite quickly, the economy has gone back to where it was before. But all of that good news on the economy was already priced into financial markets. So, you think about the start of a recovery, there's always lots of uncertainty about how strong the recovery is going to be. There's green shoots and then there's risks of double dip. So markets are a bit nervous about whether the recovery is going to last. This time we've had none of that. There's just a presumption that the recovery is here and the economy is back to where it was. But interest rates are still much lower than they were before. And so, from central banks, there's this desire to quickly move interest rates up much faster than in the past, just to get back to where they were before the crisis. But for financial markets, this is unambiguously bad news, because the recovery is priced in, but the policy tightening isn't priced in. And that's just assuming that, inflation comes down by itself. If it doesn't, and central banks actually have to tighten more forcefully to try and force inflation down, then that's compounding the bad news, because then you're talking about it hitting, future earnings and future growth as well.
Yeah, because we talked about Paul Volcker, just so everyone listening has a sense. Volcker was he actually only died about a year or two ago, at a very old age. I think he got to about 97, 98. Unbelievably tall man. This is the first thing he was about 6'10", huge guy. And he came into the Fed in the late 1970s when the American rate of inflation was in double digits. Jimmy Carter was in power. The Iranian hostages was blighting the Americans. There was a sense of America losing its way. Japanese companies were taking over in manufacturing. There was a real malaise in the States. And of course, added to that, there were very, very high levels of wage and price inflation. And Volcker came in, and it sounds mad for our generation, but raised American interest rates to 21%. Okay? Now that's at a time of inflation, maybe at 14, 15%, was a real rate of interest of 6, 7%. And if Jay Powell were to do anything like that now, your Fed funds rate would be 9, 10, 11. That won't happen, will it?
No.
Okay.
But that Volcker shock, as it's been called, I mean, what was it essentially? It was Volcker causing a recession.
A huge recession, yeah.
And guess what? If you raise the interest rate to 20% and you cause a massive recession and put millions of people out of unemployment, that does tend to bring inflation back down. It was just that the politics of doing that were just too difficult for the Fed until he came in and engineered that. I mean, it wouldn't take 20% interest rates to cause that kind of destruction this time around, just because there's so much more debt in the system.
That's where I'm going with. That's where I'm going with this question.
Yeah,
So what
you need to raise interest rates to 20%. The question, I think they can get interest rates back to where they were before the pandemic. So in the US, we have 2.5% interest rates. So that's 250 basis points from where we are now. If they try to go, really far beyond that, then that's when the squeeze is going to really be felt in the economy, because there's much more corporate debt than there was, a decade ago or 20 years ago. And once you get interest rates back to where they were before, you're already looking at debt servicing costs for most companies in the US, which are at record highs. So then you start to push interest rates more and more above that, and you're just going to squeeze these companies. And a lot of these companies just aren't profitable at all. So suddenly you're talking about bankruptcies and unemployment.
This is where I'm going with this. So if central banks do what they want to do, which is to bring the rate of inflation down via using interest rates, pushing real interest rates into positive territory and what I would say substantially positive, okay? Now, that doesn't have to be 10, it could be 2%, but that's a lot when there's a lot of debt. The other two constituencies that central banks have to listen to, even though they suggest they don't, are the political class and generally the society, the people, right? Do you think, we look at Joe Biden, we look at Boris Johnson, we look at the various different leaders in Europe, okay, who are under the umbrella of the ECB, it'd be very, very difficult for central bankers to ever do a VOCA or anything close to that, even if they want to, given the sort of constituencies they need. And that's before we talk about financial markets imploding.
Yeah, I mean, they could do it by mistake. So, the problem with raising interest rates is that you start to raise interest rates, nothing much happens. So you continue raising interest rates, nothing much happens. And then suddenly you get a recession and you're cutting interest rates very aggressively. And, it's all going to come down to what happens to inflation over the next 18 months, 2 years. I mean, I'm still...
Yeah, give me the Dario Perkins view.
You're not allowed to use the transitory word anymore.
Oh, you are.
But I think this is still transitory, and when you look at periods in the past where we've had these transitory inflation periods, so periods where inflation comes back down by itself, typically they last about 18 months, 2 years. There was always this weird perception that it would just happen in 6 months and inflation would immediately fall. That's not what happens. It never happens like that. It takes time. And my guess is that inflation will come down quite quickly, and probably in 12 months' time, we won't be thinking about a world that's overheating and having this kind of inflation problem that we have right now. But if I'm wrong on that, then central banks are really in trouble, because they're going to have to squeeze the economy to try and get inflation down. And, the cost of doing that could be huge. And we haven't been in that kind of era for a very long time. You think about previous tightening cycles. So that they usually started to raise interest rates quite early, and they tried to ensure this kind of smooth landing. So they tried to get interest rates back to neutral about the same time the economy was operating at full employment, their estimate of what full employment was. And you tried to ensure this kind of smooth glide path for the economy. And every time they started to raise interest rates, inflation was always around 2%. And then it never went anywhere. So the last 3 tightening cycles, inflation has gone nowhere. It's just been the sticky trend around 2%. This time, we're starting off, where they're much later because they've waited much longer. They think their economy is already back to full employment before they even start to tighten policy. They've got inflation at 7%. They think inflation is going to come down, but they really have no idea, where it's going to settle. And if it settles at a rate that is too high, they're going to have to do something that they haven't done since the Volcker era, which is try to force inflation down by raising interest rates. And I think, once you're in that world, they've already made serious errors. And, I put on Twitter about this Paolo Maldini quote where he said...
Oh, by the way, this is the AC Milan.
I'm an AC Milan fan.
Those men who don't know, Dario's an AC Milan fan and clearly, by default, a fan of the Italian football team. Did I tell you I saw Paolo Maldini in a
You
cafe.
did.
I swear to God,
I
in
remember he made
Milan.
quite an impression on you.
And I was just amazed by him. I just thought it was like for me, it was like, I don't know, a pop idol or something. He was brilliant. So go on. What's the Paolo Maldini quote?
The Maldini quote is that if I have to make a tackle, I've already made a mistake. And so what he was saying is, defending is all about positioning and timing. And if you get to the point where you're going to have to make that physical challenge, you've already made a mistake. You've already messed up your timing, or you've messed up your positioning. And I think something similar applies to central banking. If we're at the point where central banks are going to have to try to force inflation lower, then they've already screwed up. And, the end game there is probably going to be a recession, because in the end, that's the only real tool they've got: create a recession to try and force inflation down.
Well, as you know, concluding an economics discussion with the wisdom of Paolo Maldini is always a must on the Dave McWilliams podcast. Dario, listen, thank you so much. Great stuff.
No worries. Good to talk to you.
Paolo Maldini.
Paolo Maldini. Listen, you two guys were nerding out like two nerdy
that was the essential macroeconomics. Where's the world going? Where's the economy going? Yeah.
But okay. So let's get into this and explain it to me as the resident gobshite.
You are not the resident gobshite. You are the savant of the basement. The savant of
much.
the basement. Bringing a little bit of reality to the nerdistan that is in my head.
But come here. My understanding of, is this a classic boom bust cycle? Like with low interest rates, which we've had for forever.
For a long, long time.
Equals low unemployment, which then equals
dynamism, which then equals inflation, which then equals...
And then you're into this big cycle.
Right.
Is this a classic, or is there something different about this?
Okay. At the core, that was a discussion about whether there's going to be a recession next year or in 3 years' time.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. When economists go off like that, and we're talking at this, we have to cut to the chase. What Dario was saying there is, if the rate of inflation proves to be much, much more vibrant and dynamic and higher than it is now, central banks will have to use this incredibly blunt force, which is the rate of interest, to bring down the demand in the economy. But when so many companies are leveraged and indebted, right? If you do two things at once, you put up the price of capital, the cost of servicing your loans, number one, and you reduce the demand for goods, what you'll actually do to companies is, one, you'll reduce their revenue, out of which they pay their debt, but you'll also increase the amount of debt they have to pay.
Right.
So you'll squeeze the balance sheet on both sides.
Yeah.
This will precipitate a global recession. So what he's saying is, if he is wrong about transitory, if he is wrong about the fact that inflation is just a transitory phenomenon, and if the world and the supply chain start going back, etc., we are looking at a pretty serious global recession in the next 24 months.
But the problem there is that, as Dario just said, we won't know, your usual transitory inflation rates.
Yeah.
May last, I don't know, 12, 18, 24 months.
Yeah.
But if we wait for those 18 to 24 months, we're too late.
Well, this is the Paolo Maldini idea. So the central banks have to move now, right?
But it's a shot in the dark.
It's a shot in the dark because we've had energy price spikes before, right? So basically what's causing all this is a spike in energy costs, right? And we've had that before. Energy is the foundational price of all economics, right? But this even goes back, this is not about oil, this goes back to when we were actually trading slaves. Slaves were energy, if you think about it, right?
Okay,
because the physical energy it costs to build a pyramid was human
manpower,
muscle, right?
Yeah.
So, going right back to the Egyptians, energy has always been the foundational price in the economy. And the second foundational price has been food. But food is a function of energy, because the amount of energy you put in is the amount of energy you get out. So that's what I've always said. Economics is all about biology, because biology is all about energy.
Yeah. Well, this is this evolutionary economics.
Yeah. So if you look at the way we've evolved now, the energy prices are what we think about gas prices and oil prices, whatever. Now they tend to fluctuate very, very aggressively every 3, 4, or 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And what he's saying is that we have seen these spikes in energy prices before. And if we only just wait and chill out, what we see is they actually tend to percolate out of the economy. And the reason is the following, right? When oil prices rise, two things happen very quickly. The first is that we tend to consume less, right? Because prices go up. But probably more importantly, various different oil and gas fields are only profitable at certain very high rates of oil prices. So, for example, the cheapest place in the world to take oil out of the ground, okay, are the Saudi and UAE basins,
Yeah.
where the oil is just under the sand.
Yeah, it's very accessible.
Right. Then you have North Sea oil. Then you have shale oil, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the same goes for all sorts of fossil fuels. The more difficult the fossil fuel is to get, the more expensive it is. But when prices go up to, let's say, $80 a barrel, suddenly all these things become profitable.
Yeah.
So you get a surge of financial capital and speculative capital goes into these little ones, right? They come on stream. So what you get is amazingly, right? When oil prices go up, okay, you get a very quick impact on the economy. But what actually happens then on the demand side, what actually on the supply side is a huge amount of new oil comes on stream. Now, by the time the new oil has actually been pumped out of the ground, or new energy of any sort, the demand has already fallen. So the huge supply of new energy hits an already weakened demand, and energy prices fall right
Drop.
back.
Yeah. Okay.
So what he's saying
that
is,
makes sense.
cool your jets, relax, and let this happen.
But
right?
we also have
So we get that. So that's what his point is. But the central bankers are really worried that all this increase in energy prices increases in. So, for example, energy prices. You're talking not just energy. Fertilizer is all fossil fuel. It's chemicals, right?
Yeah.
So food prices go up, energy prices go up, heating prices go up. We're now in the winter, so that feels clearly like this.
Yeah.
It's much more. So the central bankers are kind of panicking, he's saying. But what you're saying is they don't panic. They won't know if they're panicking until it's too late.
Yeah.
And that's
And then it's hysteria.
that is the wisdom of Solomon. That is the wisdom of Solomon.
But
what
also,
to do.
there's also a couple of other key factors that are affecting this as well.
Yeah.
One, as I understand it, one is Putin and his hand on the gas tap.
Yeah.
Reducing, but he can only do that so far because he also needs the income.
He needs the income
from that.
because just I mean what Putin has done, what all Soviet leaders and Russian leaders have done since they fell upon these extraordinary energy deposits is they have been a default position of OPEC. So when OPEC pushes up oil prices, the Russians do very well. And what they do then is the Russians, through increased taxation, increased public resources, they then shower the Russian economy with goodies to keep everyone happy.
Right.
So they really need it. They can't afford to mess around. The interesting thing is suppliers of energy are much more sensitive to prices than consumers of energy. Now, that's a big shift since the 70s. In the 70s, consumers of energy were much more sensitive. And the reason is energy is now, although it's still elemental to us, there's a diverse source of energy that we can get, okay?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're actually a Putin or a Mohammed bin Salman, you really need to keep prices high and stable.
Yeah.
So you can't really...
Stability being the key.
Yeah, you can't really mess around with it.
Yeah. And the other key factor then as well is, which is this new phenomenon of the Great Resignation.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about inflation of wages, etc., with the Great Resignation, basically is putting even more pressure.
The Great
on
Resignation, yes. So the Great Resignation is basically a huge amount of millennials in the main and older boomers saying, I couldn't be bothered going back. I have enough money. And the millennials saying, I'm going to do something else. But what that does is that reduces the labor force. Now, the labor force isn't the amount of people in the country. This is the critical thing. The labor force is the amount of people in the country who make themselves available for work. Right? So the labor force is only about 65% of the total population in any country. Right? And it's been falling for a long, long time. And now it's falling even more. So what the central bankers are worried about is if wage inflation is rising, the way in which you reduce that is more people come in to work to take those jobs, okay? And therefore you get this moderation of wages, right? But if you're saying the great resignation is a problem, it is because it means that the available pool of labor is smaller.
Yes.
And therefore wage inflation is higher. Now, I've always been a bit of an unusual creature in the sense that I always think well, you know that for many years, but I think high wages are a very good sign as long as productivity is going up, right?
Yeah.
And if productivity is going up, and sometimes wages have to get more of output than profits. So profits need to fall for wages to stay the same.
Yes.
Or to rise.
Yeah.
And this isn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
And the reason it isn't a bad thing is we come back to this idea of inequality, that the way in which you suppress inequality is you actually increase wages. Because the vast
But it's
majority
more of a profit share wage.
the vast majority of people depend on wages for their income, right?
Yeah.
Only a small minority depend on dividends and rents and asset price, etc., for their income, right? So it strikes me that a society that has a rebalancing where wages go up and the return to profits falls is probably more healthy. And also the other thing is the average person spends more of their income than the rich person. This is really interesting, right? So rich people hoard money.
Yeah.
So the more very rich people you have, the more money you're actually taking out of the economy, not putting back in.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
so the more average person. So
we're all invested in Bitcoin and stuff.
But that's complete nonsense. But anyway, so I've always said, if you get somebody with, 100 million quid, it's better to have 1 million people with 100 quid than one person with 100 million quid.
Yes.
For the economy.
Yeah.
Because the 1 million people with 100 quid will go out and spend it. There's a thing called the multiplier, and it spends and it all circulates around and all that sort of stuff. So what Dario is saying is that there is a significant risk of a policy mistake in the next 12 months.
Yeah. We missed the tackle.
We missed the tackle. Exactly. Your man is burned. Now you just have to do a Cellini. Do you remember what Cellini did? The Italian, he grabbed your man with the scruff of the neck, the English fella, Sacca or whatever his name is. Then you're ruined. It's a red card straight away, right? But the chances of a global recession are getting higher and higher and higher as central bankers become less and less and less committed because they actually can't see what's going on. And if they panic and raise interest rates too quickly, which they may well do, what you will have is you have the squeeze of the economy, an unnecessarily squeeze, because what he's saying is it's unnecessary. He's taking the view, relax, stand on the ball in the middle
Cool
of the park,
your heels.
be a Chippy Brady, don't pass too quickly, take a touch, and let's see what's happening. Take a touch, isn't that a great way to end the podcast? Just take a touch.
I'm not finished yet, though, Mac.
Right, okay. What else is on your mind?
So let me ask you, just before we go, Mac, let me just ask you this one question. Because over the last couple of years on this podcast, we've been talking a lot about MMT.
Which has never been done.
Well, my understanding of MMT is that the difference between MMT and your classical economics is, in this particular inflationary situation, is that in order to bring down inflation, we would raise taxes and not interest
You're
rates.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So if we were to do that, what would happen? Or
Well,
if we
were to raise taxes now, you'd have broadly the same impact, but it wouldn't come through the financial side of the economy. It would come through the real side of the economy. So if you were
so
raise
you hit
tax,
the workers.
It would hit the workers, but you could raise corporate tax, you could raise VAT, you could do what I've always said, raise bloody property tax, which is the most ludicrous thing. We don't have one.
Yeah.
So you can. But the interesting thing about MMT has never been tried anywhere. There's been a lot of talk about it. And in the first 5 or 6 months of Biden, the Bidenomics, there was a sense that, we could do this, but it's never been done before because, again...
But this was the time for them to actually test
But they didn't do it. They didn't do it. And
Too scared?
the essence of MMT is that you spend first and tax later.
Mm.
And the essence of mainstream economics is that you tax first and you spend later. So the retort that you'd find in the pub if you said to some mates of yours, well, I think we should, build a new metro, which we really should.
Yeah.
And that's another story, right?
That is another story.
Yeah, we might come back to that. But people say, well, where are we going to find the money, right?
Who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, so the MMT idea is like you build it first and you pay for it later. You print the money, you give that money to the contractors, They build it, they employ people, they generate income. That income is then taxed. And ultimately, you spend first and tax later.
Yeah.
Right? The mainstream view is you tax first and you spend later. So you can only spend that little bit that you've left out of your taxation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But MMT has never been tried. And I'm not sure it's going to be tried now because it seems to me that everybody has gone back. What happens in difficult periods are periods of panic or periods where people lose their mojo is all good ideas. As Keynes said, it's never the good new ideas that are the problem. It's escaping the tyranny of old bad ideas. And that I think is the truth in life, that it's not embracing the new that's the problem. It's jettisoning the old in your head. This is the way I've always done it. So I'm going to do it this way.
Yeah, but that needs a certain amount of bravery.
Courage. Courage, mon ami. Mon ami, courage. Just a quick message. Listen, thank you so much to all our Patreons. We couldn't do this without your support. And if you fancy supporting us and getting all sorts of fantastic gear, economic courses, tutorials, reading lists, all that jazz, follow us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/David McWilliams.